Hi everyone. Today we are joined by a trailblazing composer and pianist, Connor Chee, who beautifully blends Western classical music and traditional Navajo music. From making his Carnegie Hall debut at just 12 years old to owning his own record label, Connor is dedicated to preserving his culture through powerful and evocative music. Hope you enjoy the interview. Hi Connor, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course, let's jump right in. So, for those who are unfamiliar with your story, can you tell us who was the first person to offer you a seat at the piano?
It was my parents, and I think it was a little unintentional because my dad received a gift of like a small keyboard, and neither of my parents played piano, but I was like really fascinated with it. I think I was about 5 years old. So I was playing by ear and just kind of making up my own music on that. And my parents eventually, they saw I was interested, got me lessons. And then eventually, when my piano teacher was like, he can't be learning piano on this little keyboard, eventually invested in an actual piano for me, which I actually still have to this day.
Oh, that's amazing. Do you ever revisit it, go back, play around, or anything like that?
Yeah, I had a couple, and there's like a little tiny toy piano that's still floating around in storage right now. But
Amazing. You've talked a lot about how the number four means how important it is in Navajo culture. I was curious if someone was listening to your music for the first time, what are the four songs that you would recommend that they listen to?
that's a good question. I think the earliest collection I did was my Navajo vocables for piano. Another one I would recommend maybe is Unbroken, music for the Navajo Code Talkers. That was commissioned by Your Classical NPR and APM. There, I think it's online. There's like an interview with me talking a little bit, but you can hear the whole performance. But that was a piece in four movements that also has the number four sort of thrown in there, and it was a tribute to the Navajo Code Talkers, World War II. Female Rain's another one I like. It's a little bit different than some of the things I wrote because it has a little bit of a quasi improvisational section to it. And that one was really a piece about nature, and I'd written some things about where I'm from in the Navajo Nation. And so that one was one that's special to me that I like to perform. And I'd say a fourth one would be any of the pieces in my collection, sand paintings for piano. And those are also divided into sets of four. So you could also just listen to four of those. Those I have a melody like that are all related between the sets of four pieces. So there's four pieces about clouds, four about our sacred mountains, sacred stones, lightning. And so those all have the same melody that is like in a different version, like inversion or backwards. And it sort of paints this musical image that's inspired by the visual art of the Navajo people.
That's incredible. I also want to talk about one of your more recent works, Across the Desert, A Long Walk Home. This was such a beautiful project. Not only you incorporated piano and vocals, but you also included orchestral versions of each song as well. I absolutely love that. I want to know, like, what inspired that decision?
Well, I released mostly just solo piano albums, and I wanted to include some of the original songs that were from the era of The Long Walk that I knew. So I wanted it to be more than just the solo piano for that, because I wanted to actually allow the listener to hear some of the traditional songs. From that idea came this thought that I could, what I'm doing is very often blending classical music with some of our traditional Diné or Navajo music. So it sort of seemed like a natural path to have it be sort of an orchestral arrangement with some of the traditional singing involved. So I sort of designed the album to have these piano versions that are sort of back to back with the original song that it was based on, which is also like orchestrated.
It was executed so beautifully. One of my favorite pieces on that album is the introduction, which is Dawn of Displacement. That song holds such weight and emotion, and it feels very cinematic. And I know you've worked on some film scores in the past. I'm curious if that's something you're still interested in exploring, and if so, what type of films you'd like to score.
Yeah, it's definitely an interest. I'm working on two film scores right now. I'm doing one that is sort of a documentary with Dartmouth College about Samson Occam, one of the, they say, forgotten founders of the college. I'm really excited about all these projects I get brought onto that I don't know what to expect because I've done everything from some very interesting documentaries to like short horror films, or I did one that was sort of a documentary on artificial intelligence. So I love being able to not only just test my creative limits, but it's also an opportunity to sort of break out of what I usually do when I'm writing concert music. I feel like I have a little bit of a different palette that I'm working with depending on what the director's looking for. So that's what's really exciting for me is this potential to do something totally different that I've never done before.
That's amazing. I'm so excited for more. So, Connor, you said a quote that really stood out to me. You said, "Our culture isn't confined to the biases or stereotypes people often have about us." So I was curious, throughout the amazing success you've had, has there ever been time where you've been met with other people's ignorance? Or like, if you ever felt like you didn't belong in the classical music space?
Definitely, yeah. And I think sometimes it was like the ignorance that it wasn't on purpose, and sometimes it definitely was like a microaggression where, people were almost putting me in my place through the way that they phrased things. But, I'm really glad to see that there's so much more work being done for inclusivity, especially in recent years. I think it's really important because I really almost kind of walked away from everything because I felt like I didn't have a place. And so things like A Seat at the Piano and other organizations that are actually making sure that there is space for people who have something different to offer. I think that's exciting and I think it's really important because I know I've experienced it a lot and it can be so discouraging, which is difficult, especially in a creative space.
Yeah, 100%. And to follow up on that, I was curious if there's any ways that you are trying to make music a more accessible or welcoming space.
I think that music's a great way to sort of bridge cultural divides because it's something that captures you kind of instantly if you connect with that music without any of these other like masks that we wear or without any of the triggering language or anything like that. It's such a great way to open a conversation about culture. And it goes both ways, also for me, where I'm sharing my music and I'm explaining the cultural elements behind it. And I'm also learning about other people's culture because undoubtedly, as I'm sharing this, people are responding with, "Oh, that's really interesting. That lines up with something that's in my culture. That's from a totally different part of the world," or things like that, where it just opens up this exchange that I think I would have never had with so many people about these really interesting, rich cultural elements if it wasn't for the fact that music was where it started and made that initial connection.
To me, you've really expanded what it means to be a musician. You know, you're not just a pianist and a composer, you also own a record label, which is very, very interesting. So I'm curious, like, how did this begin? How is it going? And what do you see for the future for this record label?
And it really started as just a way for me to be putting my music out there and as hopefully something that could be a platform for other artists. So I've worked with other artists that maybe have a lot of experience in music and have a lot to offer, but might not have very much experience in the recording industry or that side of things, which I have learned, myself through trial and error and many other things. So it was really something that I was like, this could be something good for me to sort of organize what I'm doing in this part of my career, this the recording side, and also if I can uplift other artists that are interested in sort of getting into the recording industry and sort of guide them and get their music out there as well. So I hope to continue that in the future. I've had some collaborations. I've got one on the radar right now of someone that I'm going to be hopefully working with and putting out some new music. So that really is the goal. I know it would have been so helpful for me if I had something like some sort of more solid guidance when I was trying to do this myself. So I just hope to sort of allow people to have a little bit easier transition jumping into something they might not be familiar with.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a perfect example of you making music more accessible. Like that's absolutely incredible. While I have you here, we have to talk about your music videos. They are incredible, and there's something that you don't often see in this realm from classical pianists. So I know when you were filming these videos, there were some hiccups. I believe that, issue with like power on the location, the heat, building like the shelf or the keyboard. I'm curious, like, out of all the challenges you faced, like, what was the main thing that you learned from creating these music videos?
I was resisting doing any music videos because it was kind of outside the norm and I was afraid of like the judgment or maybe people wouldn't take me as seriously, but I also had to think about how people are consuming music and how that's changing. And so I don't want to be that person that resists change when we have to, adapt to what the audience wants. So that was really when I sort of took this dive into doing the music videos. I was very hesitant and I was very nervous, but I think the first one I did pretty well. Like it got my music into the playlist of more listeners, and people also appreciated that visual element. So when I moved forward with the music videos for scenes from Denetra, I actually had those in mind when I was composing the music. So I knew there were some visual elements that I could work into the musical palette that I'd created or different things that I could show visually, even though I'd recorded and composed these pieces before really planning the videos like really in a detailed way. So I was really fortunate to have a friend of mine, Michael at City Jr., who was the director, and he did the filming and the editing for those videos, and really also had a great understanding of music so that he could edit that and create something that really lined up with my vision for what it was going to be. So it was definitely some challenges, and it was something that I'd never done before. And we were also doing it on a very tight budget. And so there was all these things, and there's always things that you just don't expect to happen. But we managed to get them together. So it was overall a very positive experience that I hope to be able to do more in the future.
And speaking of Mikey, how is it working with someone that also understands your culture as well?
It was really interesting because Mikey and I first met in piano lessons when I must have been 6 or 7 years old. And then we didn't see each other for a long time, but reconnected a few years before we worked on these music videos together. So it was cool that, we had this sort of long-term friendship, but also we had this shared cultural identity that he understood deeply. And he understood music, and he, even though he didn't go on to do piano professionally, he knew the piano, he still plays piano, and so he understands music in a way I think that was really important for him to do what he did with the videos. So that was a really fun collaboration actually, because I think he really understood so much of what I wanted to do. And then he also is a very creative person and was able to add things that I hadn't thought of, or do things that I wouldn't have done myself that actually turned out really well. So I was really grateful to have him not just fulfilling my vision, but also adding his own like artistic ideas to the videos. I think that really made it special for me.
On the realm of music videos, word on the street, Connor, is that you're also doing your own recordings for your collection of sand paintings. I was wondering, since you're doing your own recordings, will we also be getting some music videos from these pieces as well?
That is the plan. Yes, I do want to have some more music videos. I feel like it's been too long since I've done some music videos, so I've been doing so many other things that I need to get back to some of the stuff that's important to me, that being, these recordings and also music videos. And I'm also working on doing some music videos with Joel Shanehouse, who commissioned sand paintings, and he commissioned a new set of 16 etudes that has just been premiered a few months ago. And so he's going to be doing some video performances of those, but we're also going to include some things because I want to sort of describe some of the underpinnings of these etudes and the cultural background. So we're going to have some videos that sort of incorporate both me sort of doing that storytelling aspect and also talking about, the point of each etude alongside the actual performance of those. So that's something that's also on the radar.
Ah, exciting news. I'm so excited for it. Additionally, Connor, you are a jack of all trades. You've done so much. You're also a pianist for a musical called Unlikely Allies. Please tell me all about it. That's so cool. And I was curious, like, if you ever thought that you'd be a part of a musical before.
I never envisioned it, but I think I didn't envision a lot of the things that I'm involved in, which is so exciting. And so this was a collaboration that has come about through another friendship of mine, David Gargaro, who's the composer for this musical, which is based on the book by Joel Richard Paul, Unlikely Allies. I, keep in touch with David regularly, and he told me about this musical that he's working on. He's composing this music, so he would send me little samples of things, sketches that he was working on. And ultimately, I was honored to be asked to work with him as the pianist for this. So we did our first reading in May in at the Steinway Gallery in San Francisco, which was about half the musical. And I think we're going to do the full reading of the full musical in October on the 30th and 31st in New York City on 42nd Street. But it's an exciting story. It's based on the American Revolution and these unlikely allies that came together, securing French support for the war and really helped win the war. And they're sort of these figures that were so important but aren't always discussed. The music that David's written is really, really beautiful music, and everything that we've done so far is really exciting. So, and it was really well received by the audience in our first reading. So, not something I'd envisioned myself doing, but again, I sort of always keep my doors open to anything that comes my way. I've always loved musicals, and yeah, so I was excited to be part of this process. It's not something I've done before. So, being part of the process while he's composing and reworking these things and doing readings and working with vocalists, all of this like pre-production kind of stuff before the big performances it's exciting for me, and it's a learning experience.
Connor, you've talked a lot about how important family is in your life. So I was wondering if you could describe a time where music brought your family together and how that really shaped you as a composer.
I was really fortunate to have the support of my family, not just my parents and my siblings, but also my extended family. And that is something I always appreciated when I did a performance back home. I would have family that would come to support me. Even if they weren't nearby, family would just make the drive, hours to make sure that they were here. And so in that way, I appreciated their support, but also the fact that we also were brought together and were able to do things outside of that. It was kind of like this reason to get together. And then, we enjoyed all the other things that come with, reuniting with family. And my grandfather on my dad's side, Keith Chee, he was a medicine man and he sang, and it was a very similar thing where his music also brought us together, brought the family together, and was sort of that pillar that kept everyone together. Family's so important. Nobody does anything on their own. And, I certainly have put in a lot of work, but I would be nowhere if I didn't have the support of my family and friends and teachers. So that kind of goes along with our idea of kinship, of what we call ke, of how we're all sort of this community and we have to lift each other up. We treat each other as family. With our clan system, we introduce ourselves with our four clans, and that's part of seeing how we're related to each other. So when I'm meeting other people that are Navajo people, if we're related by clan, we refer to each other with terms as if we're family, brothers or sisters or parents or grandparents. That's the terminology we use once we know our clan relation. So even if it's not a blood relation, we do consider it family. And we treat each other that way. And it's important to uplift each other, and community is so important in so many ways. So I'm very grateful that music has played a part in that. And it goes both ways. Music's brought us together, but being a part of that community also fostered my ability to do music.
Yeah, absolutely. Connor, you've mentioned something that I found really interesting. You've talked about how Navajo weavers are taught to purposefully put a mistake in the items that they're creating. I was curious if you could talk about a time where you've embraced a creative mistake that you've made.
I feel like I'm always making mistakes. I'm trying to think of a specific example, but I think a lot of it has to do with also me letting go of this idea of perfection, where I know that something's not perfect, but something I get asked a lot is like, how do you know when your piece is finished? And I'm like, I don't. When I have to send it in an email, or the PDF has to be sent, or when the tracks have to be delivered, that's when it's done. And so when I'm working on projects, I have to remind myself that, I could keep revising, and at some point it's not getting better. It's just becoming different. And so allowing myself that, hey, this doesn't have to be perfect for it to be a worthy work of art or a piece of music, and letting that go so I can move on to complete the rest of the project. That was difficult for me, but that was definitely me sort of accepting my imperfections and my mistakes. And also I think in some of my pieces, I think I mentioned earlier, like Female Rain, have sort of these quasi improvisatory sections, and that kind of went along with the same ideas that I didn't want anything that was note perfect. I wanted it to be a little bit different every time. I wanted people to have a little bit of freedom to do their interpretation of what it meant to them. And so having a notated score that sort of has structure but has these moments that can be different and purposefully not perfect, not note perfect, not according to this blueprint that I put out there, but that's going to change, also was really inspired by this idea of imperfection in the weavings and creating something that's still beautiful, even though you know that it is purposely imperfect. We can still celebrate its beauty. It sort of made its way into my compositions in many different ways, in addition to me just making flat out mistakes sometimes and having to run with it.
That's beautiful and an incredible lesson to learn, genuinely. And lastly, for our final question, what do you hope your seat at the piano says to others who are still searching for theirs?
I hope that it just inspires possibility. I think that's something that I struggled with when I was younger because it wasn't as easy to find the role models that were from Native communities in classical music. It's not that they didn't exist, it's just that they were not as accessible to me. And some of the people in my life who were very discouraging to me because their argument was that, well, it's not something that Native people do. Like they can't keep up, they can't compete with the rest of the world, which wasn't true. And I think I would have had an easier time in my childhood if I had found some of these role models that are out there and to see that it is possible. It wasn't something that was just totally out of the realm of possibility. So I hope that, seeing that people do have a place and that you can make a place. The world is always changing and you can make space for yourself and for other people. I think that's something really special. And I hope that I can inspire others. It's just the idea of possibility and having a place.
That's incredible and so important. Connor, thank you so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.